All right, hello everybody. We are back again for another Legends of Lightning workshop. This time around, we got Jake from Mash. Jake is an engineer, one of the co-founders of Mash, and today he's going to be talking about Lightning Address and adding it as part of your user experience. Jake, I tend to not really hang around too much for the intro, so I'll just hand it over to you. But maybe you can just start by giving a little brief introduction about yourself and what you do with MASH, and then we can go from there.
Awesome. Yeah, so hello everybody, I'm Jake. I'm building at MASH, and yeah, we're focused on kind of bringing Lightning to the web and creating new ways that creators and builders that are either creating content or software on the internet can monetize what they're building. So yeah, that's kind of what we're focusing on, and it's been just over like a year and a half or so that we've been building. So, and yeah, I'm looking forward to talking about Lightning addresses.
Cool. Alrighty. Well, I'll hand it over to you, and then I'll pop back in at the end for some questions and stuff. If anybody
Perfect.
has any questions from the audience, I see a few of you are watching live. Feel free to just drop them in the comments, and we'll get around to them at the end, where Jake can kind of answer some of your questions and queries. But yeah, over to you, Jake. I'll catch you soon.
Great. Thanks, Ed. All right. So yeah, as I mentioned, I'm Jake. I'm a founding engineer at MASH, and I'm going to be talking about what Lightning addresses are, uh, digging into the UX that they kind of provide, and then also some of the technical details around how they can be implemented. So just to start, kind of did this at the beginning, but just to recap. So I'm Jake, I'm at MASH. I kind of mentioned we're focused on monetizing the web. And one of the things that is kind of interesting that we're really focusing on is how can we bring new kind of Lightning user experiences specifically to the web in kind of ways that we haven't seen up to this point. So we're thinking a lot about the user experience on Lightning and kind of the tools and protocols and things like that that we can use to make it a little bit better. So just really quickly, Mash, if you're not familiar with us, our current product is a little wallet that you can install on your website. And the idea is, your users don't have to download anything. It just gets added like as a snippet of code, pops up on your site, and then we have a little SDK that lets you hook into it to kind of make it really easy to do the payment part. And we do some kind of things on top that let you do things with your pricing model. So you can set, freebies. You can set maximum amount that people can spend per month, and those sorts of things. We're really just looking to make it easy for people building on the web to monetize their stuff with Lightning. And so kind of looks like this. There's a little graphic on the left there kind of showing, maybe you have a button. This is showing our boost button, which is kind of like a tip. But really you can, both accept donations and monetize, downloads, videos, that sort of stuff. So yeah, so that's kind of what we're doing at MASH. Um, so just calling out a couple things here going into this. Uh, don't necessarily need to, have all of these, but if you want to get the most out of this, you should probably have a little bit of an understanding of how Lightning works, specifically how both 11 invoices work, some familiarity with HTTP and JSON, and there's a lot of emojis in this, so hopefully you also like emojis as well. So kind of at the high level, what are Lightning addresses if you're not familiar with them? So they're just internet identifiers. They kind of look like an email address. So I have mine there that we have at Mash, getmash.cash. And the whole idea is they can be used to receive Bitcoin over the Lightning Network in a really user-friendly way. Excuse me, user-friendly way. So if you're familiar with kind of the current Lightning UX, it's a lot of strings and QR codes. And so this is aiming at just making that experience a little bit better. And it's based on this suite of protocols around LNURL Pay. And I'm going to be talking about that quite a bit Yeah, so uh, kind of don't worry about what this LUD thing is here, but um, as I kind of mentioned, uh, there are kind of layers to how the lightning address kind of protocol works. So, at the top we have the addresses that the user sees, and there's some, you know, uh, schemes and protocols kind of built on top of this LNURL pay system, which itself is built on top of both 11. And I'm going to kind of walk through each layer and how things change as kind of you go from both 11, which is kind of the simplest, like the original form, and going up and kind of what each layer adds and gives to you. So let's take a look at what the basic Lightning user experience is like. So kind of have this set up as if it was a text between two people. So you could imagine maybe somebody uh, bought pizza for somebody else and they want to pay them back. Maybe they'll text them and say, "Hey, can I pay you 25,000 sats for the pizza last night or something?" That person might send them a QR code, and then maybe that gets scanned on their phone or fed into a wallet, a Lightning wallet, basically gets paid over the Lightning network, and then the person who the sender kind of sent the funds and the receiver received them, and all is good. Um, but there's some kind of properties of this that are maybe not super ideal in all scenarios. So one of the things that can't be done kind of with vanilla both 11 invoices is you can't reuse them. So let's say we go out for pizza every Friday, and I just want to give you this thing, and you can pay me every Friday using the same code. That isn't really possible right now with kind of the basic both 11 invoices. And there's also this requirement that the person who's receiving the funds needs to manually provide the Lightning address out of band to the person that's going to be paying. So they need to be sitting there responding to their text messages, kind of thing, and kind of be an active part of that process. And then there's also this other kind of UX side of the person who's actually sending the funds. They're either going to be scanning a QR code or copying a string or something like that, which sometimes isn't the greatest experience. So, are there ways of automating part of this or making it a little bit easier? So, thinking about the person who's receiving kind of first, um, this is where LNURL Pay comes in. So, um, if you're not really familiar with LNURL Pay, it's part of this suite of specs that different wallets and platforms implement. There's multiple kind of sub specs that do different things, but the pay kind of side of things give a couple of nice properties that kind of augment the user experience on Lightning. So it solves that kind of first thing that I mentioned, where I can provide you with a static URL or a static QR code, and you can always use that whenever you want to pay me. And I don't necessarily, in most situations, need to be there to manually generate the invoice. So I'm going to have a system do it for me. I can be totally offline, and and I'll be able to accept payments from you. And the nice thing about it is it's an interoperable kind of open standard. So I've listed out a couple of wallets and apps there that work with LNURL Pay in terms of being able to pay to these QR codes and also receive to them. And that list is kind of growing. Yeah, and there is a caveat though in that in order to kind of support LNURL Pay, you need to have a web service of some kind. And this is kind of one of the criticisms maybe of LNURL Pay, but it definitely has its place for certain kind of situations. Maybe you're like a Lightning uh, provider or something like that, where you already have a web service or web presence, and you have the infrastructure to do that. This is really great for those kind of scenarios. So, if we now have LNURL Pay, what does the experience look like for our senders and receivers? So now instead of the sender needing to request from the receiver, hey, can you give me an invoice for this amount? The receiver can give a static QR code and say, hey, if you ever want to pay me, just use this later. You'll be able to specify how much you want to pay me. Just this is kind of your gateway. So maybe that person, stores it somewhere. Maybe it's on a website or something like that. But the important thing being the sender has access to this kind of static code that they can pay to pay the receiver. So when it comes time to actually make a payment, kind of what does that look like? And this is kind of a really simplified view of what this might look like, but it might be like, hey, I want to pay Joe. Joe is sleeping. You can see on the top right there. And then a system is going to respond and be like, how much do you want to pay? And I can respond and say, about 25,000 sats this time for pizza. And then I can keep, maybe tomorrow I want to do that again. I can keep doing that over and over. And Joe on the right there, the receiver doesn't need to be online. And he doesn't need to keep manually generating invoices for me over and over himself. And so what are the different pieces that kind of make this happen? So within the LN URL repo, there are these things called LUDs, which are basically just the different specs that make up the different pieces of the LN URL kind of ecosystem. And so the first one that's important is LUD1, which kind of specifies how URLs that are used in the world of LN URL are encoded. So I have an example at the top there. It looks pretty similar to like a Bolt 11 because it is Bec32 encoded, and there's a decoder that knows how to handle that, and it translates it to a URL. And it can be either HTTPS or Onion, and you can kind of, as you saw, bake it into a QR code if you want. Which you'll see often. And there's if you want to see kind of some ways that this is being iterated on, you can check out LUD 17. There's some changes there, namely around like kind of how the URLs are structured. You can use like custom schemes and stuff like that. And there's actually they're trying to get rid of Bec32 encoding. But check that out if you want to see a little bit more about that. And there's this tool that Fiat Draft has. He's one of the kind of core contributors to the LN URL spec. I think it's really his baby. He has this nice tool online where you can just feed in an LN URL string that's encoded and it'll decode it for you. So I put in one from our system there, and you can see it's just a URL. So we know how to encode the URLs. How do we kind of define what the flow is for what I showed before, where we're automating the requesting and generating of both 11 invoices and paying them? So LUD 6 kind of gives this, which is the LNURL pay base spec. And this is what defines kind of what happens when a user puts in their like the QR code or the URL. What happens, when the wallet actually reads it in, like what should it be showing to the user? So it should be like asking how much, and optionally there's also support for giving like a comment if you want to send a message. And then it also kind of specifies between the two, like the wallet and the receiver system, what that fetching and paying of the invoice looks like. And I'll mention, like, obviously the paying of the invoice is done natively through the Lightning Network. But really this is focusing on that automated fetching of the Bolt 11 invoice on behalf of the receiver in a nice way so that they don't have to manually kind of keep generating the invoices. And it does define some requirements for the UI and the user experience, just to kind of make sure that the sender is aware of what's going on. So stuff like showing the domain name. There's like metadata that gets shown, maybe an image, that sort of thing. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. And if you want to check out a little bit more about comments specifically, you can go to LUD 12, which is kind of like an extension of the base spec. So going back to this kind of scenario, as I mentioned, now things are it can be done through these static codes. We give that to our sender out of band. Maybe it's on a website, as I mentioned, or text or something like that, and the sender can store it and reuse it over and over. So now I'm going to take a look at that kind of simplified view before, where the sender was talking to a robot. I'm going to dig into the kind of details on like what's actually going on. So here is kind of the setup that if we're zooming in a little bit, we still have our sender. They have a wallet, which is that little laptop money bag column, and then the receiver is going to have a web system that they've set up to hook into their Lightning wallet to generate invoices on their behalf. And so what does this flow look like? So the sender provides a QR code. Maybe they've scanned it in through their phone, and they have a Lightning wallet on their phone. So what's going to happen is it's going to decode the image to that encoded LNURL string. It's going to decode that string to a URL, and then all it's going to do is do a GET request to that URL. And the response that's going to come back from the sender service is JSON. And I'm going to dig in a little bit into the pieces of that JSON and kind of what's going on there. So sender's wallet makes a GET request to that decoded URL, get a JSON response back. What's inside this thing? So the most important thing is this tag that you see at the top there. As I mentioned, LNURL has a lot of kind of different base specs for different things. So pay request is just signifying like, hey, this is an LNURL pay link. You can generate both 11 invoices with this. And then based on that, there's some other fields that are required. So callback is another URL, and that is what's used for fetching the invoice. And then there are fields basically specifying the minimum and maximum in millisats that can be requested. And then there's a metadata string. And I had originally some description on what's required in this metadata string, but it was a little bit gnarly. So I would definitely encourage you to look at the spec if you want to kind of dig in there. But the kind of gist of it is a string. So it's encoded as a string, but it's JSON, and it's an array where each of the items is like another array that's a tuple of key value pairs that contain some metadata. So I have the beginning of one there, which is like the basic description, which is always required. So maybe in this case it's message. And then you can do other stuff like add images and that sort of thing. But really the thing that you need is at least a description so that the wallet of the sender can kind of explain what's going on to the person before they actually make their decision. So what happens once the sender's wallet actually has this JSON and they know what the callback is and kind of the parameters that are available to them and the ranges and that sort of thing? They're going to prompt the user and be like, hey, how much do you actually want to pay the receiver? They need to show the domain, so it's from pay.com, and the description that kind of came along with it, which is it was in that metadata blob. So then the user will kind of read that, make sure everything's good. Maybe there's some images with the logo or something. They're happy with it, and they decide to send that 25,000 sats that they had wanted to send originally. And what the wallet does with that is they take it and they use that callback that was returned before with this amount query string parameter. And that is the amount requested by the user in millisats. And what the receiver's system is going to do is they're going to go to the Lightning wallet. Maybe it's like LND sitting behind a web service, and the web service is connecting to LND with their gRPC API or something like that. And it's scoped down to have a macaroon that can only request invoices or something like that. Kind of the point is though, it could be anything as long as the output is a Bolt 11 invoice, which is that PR key that you see there. And so the idea is I make a GET request to this callback, specify the amount, and it's the job of the receiver service to give me an invoice back to the sender's wallet. And then because the sender kind of already approved when they originally specified the amount, there's no need to prompt them again to like approve it. But there's some kind of verification that goes on just to make sure that there's nothing fishy happening. So namely, like, let's make sure that the amount that I asked for is actually what's contained within the invoice. And there's also this checking of the H tag within the Bolt 11 invoice that goes on, which I'm going to talk about a little bit in the next slide. But really, that's just making sure that the metadata that was originally returned in that first GET request that we saw on the previous slide matches kind of what's captured within the Bolt 11 invoice. And then if everything looks good, the sender's wallet is going to pay the invoice on their behalf via the Lightning Network. And that's kind of it. So I mentioned this H tag and just making sure that the metadata was all good. What does that actually mean though? So if you're not familiar with the H tag, I think, if you've dug into Bolt 11, at least kind of an initial digging in, normally you're using this description or memo, which is like the kind of shorter description for the invoice, but sometimes, maybe you have more data that you want to put in there. It's over 639 bytes. There's this kind of mechanism to instead switch over to H, which is a hash of your description. So only one or the other can be provided. And in this case, and that little snippet there, I promise this is the only kind of code in this presentation that's taken from the LNURL repo. And it's just basically saying like, hey, you need to take your unescaped metadata string. So like, without the slashes and that sort of stuff, create a byte array, UTF-8 byte array, and then just generate the SHA-256 hash from that. And as the receiver kind of service, you need to do that and put it within the H tag. And then it's also the responsibility of the sender who is, generating the invoice with LNURL pay to make sure that H tag matches the metadata that was originally returned. So both are kind of computing it, and there's a check by the sender before they actually pay the invoice that was returned, just to make sure that nothing kind of fishy is going on. And so, like a kind of real example of this, Andre Nevis of Zebedee has this nice tool. I believe it's created by him because it's under his GitHub, but it's live if you want to check it out. And you can feed in an encoded LNURL string, and it'll basically do that first GET request for you and show you all that. Basically, the JSON that I showed previously with the callback, the min and max, the description that might be pulled from the metadata, any other metadata, and then you can see at the bottom there the pay request tag, just saying that, hey, this is an LNURL pay link. And so, if I were implementing like a wallet or something that I want to be able to pay out to LNURL pay URLs, maybe I do something like this. I get my callback, and then in my code, I'm doing something like this, where I'm doing a GET request to that URL with, as I mentioned, the amount query string parameter. That's the amount in millisats that I want to generate an invoice for. And then I get that invoice back in the PR key there, and I do the checks that I mentioned and make sure everything's okay. And then if everything's good, I'll make the payment. So that's pretty awesome. The receiver doesn't need to sit there and manually generate Bolt 11 invoices. I can just give you one static thing and you can pay me over and over. And I don't need to be online or anything like that. I just need a system that's available on the web that connects to my kind of hot Lightning wallet and can generate invoices on my behalf. But it's still a little bit annoying for the sender because they're dealing with QR codes and URLs. Maybe you are needing to scan it on your phone from your laptop or copy it over, if you're on the same machine or something like that, which isn't necessarily always ideal. So this is kind of where Lightning addresses come in. So as I mentioned before, it's really nice. You just kind of specify, if I want to receive payments from someone, rather than giving the LNURL QR code, I'm just going to give you my Lightning address. So in this case, it's jake@getmash.cash. And similar to LNURL, kind of pay and all the other LNURL specs, it's interoperable and it's an open standard, so any wallet can implement it, and they'll be able to communicate. And there's some more wallets there that I've listed that have implemented it. But the kind of cool thing about it is this is really just a scheme really on top of LNURL Pay for structuring LNURL Pay URLs in a like human readable format. And I'm going to kind of show you what I mean in a second, but just concretely, like, what is the spec that's powering this? It's LUD16. So Lightning addresses are just another LNURL spec. And they kind of specify a way for you to use LNURL Pay to receive payments with internet identifiers. And the idea is, as I mentioned, you're getting an address instead of a string or a QR code. And it also works with Onion services. And so what's going on here though? So as I mentioned before, LNURL Pay, the kind of entry point for someone who wants to make a payment is the encoded URL. And so you're either scanning the QR code or copying that long string. And this is just a scheme for mapping that to a route that's offered on the service that's acting as the Lightning address provider. So this is inspired by the LNURL and Lightning address kind of repos. They do a really good job of breaking this down, and I've kind of just pulled it in. But if you have jake@getmash.cash, what's going on is the first URL that you make a GET request to in the LNURL Pay flow is this URL here, where you take the domain, which is where you're going to be making the request to over HTTPS, or if it's Onion, it's going to be over Onion, with this .wellknown/LNURLP prefix and then the associated username. And so as long as your service that is implementing LNURL Pay on the receiver side has this route, you support Lightning addresses with kind of like a caveat. There's some requirements that need to be, some requirements in terms of the metadata that needs to be returned. I'll talk about that in a second, but this is kind of the gist of it. So it's just really a scheme for structuring LNURL Pay URLs to make it a little bit easier for people to remember. So I don't need to go to your site to scan your QR code. It's just a matter of me typing it into my app or something like that. And so how does this change things? So as I mentioned, it's just LNURL Pay. So, if you remember before, the sender would be, either providing a QR code or a string to their wallet. And instead this time, they're going to be giving the address. Maybe they've typed it in or clicked on it or something. And then all that's going on is that first LNURL Pay GET request is just going to that URL based on the scheme that I mentioned. And then it's just returning that JSON that I showed earlier with the callback and all that sort of thing. And then there's some notes here in the metadata chunk that I talked a bit about. You need to have an internet identifier in that because it is associated with a Lightning address. So there's a requirement with the metadata. And then, optionally, you can also lean on LUD12, which you can dig into if you'd like, which just specifies a way of providing comments with LNURL Pay. If, when I type in Joe at getmash.cash, I want to also send a message, but that's optional. And then once you have that, that's the JSON that's coming back from that first GET request, and you just kind of follow the rest of the LNURL Pay flow, and it kind of just works as it did before. So, if you've implemented a service that's acting as a LNURL Pay provider for receiving funds, it's pretty trivial to also support Lightning addresses, because it's quite literally just setting up this route and making sure that your JSON that's being returned kind of matches those extra requirements. So, what are some kind of final thoughts on LNURL Pay and Lightning addresses? So, there's some really good pre-built tools that are out there. A lot of them are from, I think I mentioned both of them, Fiat Joff and Andre Nevis from Zebedee, that kind of let you get Lightning addresses out of the box, or make it really easy to build LNURL Pay stuff. So there's some bridges that are available. What's cool about those is you basically, the way that they've implemented them is you just need a domain that you want to serve LNURL Pay and Lightning address requests from, and then you just set up your DNS records. So all you need is a domain, and a lot of the time the domain providers make it really easy to go in and add DNS records. So they kind of specify, here are the DNS records that you need to add that tell it how to connect to your node. So in the case of like LND, maybe it's like the URL that the API is available at, and a macaroon that is just scoped down to generating invoices or something like that. They support a bunch of different backends, so really easy to do that. If you just have a Lightning wallet that's online that you want to provide a Lightning address for. And then there's also a lot of really kind of helpful libraries for building stuff from scratch, if that's kind of more what you're wanting to do. And so like there's one that's Go, one that's Node.js, and then also like JavaScript in the front end sort of thing for both, writing services that are able to receive with LNURL Pay and Lightning addresses, and then also pay to LNURLs and Lightning addresses. I will also call out, there's a proposal out right now that's getting a little bit of movement called Bolt 12. If you're not familiar with it, I would also recommend checking that out, because it's proposing that a lot of these issues that I mentioned earlier get addressed at the Lightning level with a new spec. And so they're very kind of similar in the sense that LNURL Pay lets you provide a static QR code or code that can get paid to, except it just kind of how they go about implementing them are pretty different. So definitely check that out though. And then if you're not familiar with LNURL, there are a couple of sub protocols that do other stuff. So you can set up a system that can withdraw to wallets. So you kind of flip it around, and maybe now the person on the left in my diagrams is instead requesting that the person on the right pay them when that person is offline. There's also a spec for doing authentication with Lightning Wallet keys. So there's a couple of things in there. Definitely check it out if you haven't before. And yeah, I would say if you're really interested, just read all of the LUDs, because they're pretty digestible. And there's kind of there's not a ton of them. I think there's just up to 20 right now. So definitely doable if you're really interested, and they're not very long. And once you do that, you'll definitely have a pretty good understanding of the ecosystem and how some of them are implemented. And then, if you're really, really interested and you're kind of wanting to engage, definitely check out the LNURL spec, the LUD kind of repo, and there's a Telegram group as well that's pretty active, where there's a lot of discussion going on there. Yeah, and that's kind of it. Thanks a lot for listening. And again, yeah, I'm Jake from Mash, and definitely check us out if you haven't heard of us before. And yeah, I'm excited to see if more systems end up implementing Lightning addresses and LNURL Pay and kind of become a part of the ecosystem. So thank you.
All right. Jake, that was wicked. Thank you very very much. I will let some sort of I'll let some questions sort of trickle in from the audience. But maybe we can just get started with a few really simple ones. I'm a new user to Lightning. I've heard of this Lightning address thing. How can I get myself one? Because from what I've seen, there are a lot of different sort of competing. I don't know if I'd say competing, but there are a lot of people who are providing Lightning addresses. What's the best place to go as someone who's just coming in, getting started? What sort of services would you recommend? Yeah, where do I start?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would definitely recommend going to the Lightning address website. I believe it's lightningaddress.com, but maybe just double check that. And yeah, there you can kind of see there who's implemented it in terms of both the receiving and sending end. And if you already have a custodial wallet, or you don't have one yet and you're a little bit familiar with Lightning and you want to use that as a way of trying it out, they kind of outline a few in there that you can download that work in terms of both paying to and also giving you your own Lightning address. And then there's also some options there as well for non-custodial if you have a node running and you want your own Lightning address. So definitely check out the website. There's some really good information there. Yeah, and then the only other thing I'll mention on that too is if you end up implementing support for Lightning addresses, check out the GitHub repo because you can kind of submit yourself to the index there so that people know that you support it.
Cool. So you mentioned some non-custodial people there. I think obviously I had sort of a query around privacy and things like that, and obviously just like having to rely on a um, a provider to be able to sort of host the address for me online. And there are obviously a lot of things there, but you mentioned that there may be some non-custodial solutions there. Like how does that work? Is it essentially like a bridge solution or?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I think I linked to a couple of them there. Um, but there's some bridge some bridge solutions available that basically just let you'll install or use a pre-existing service that just connects to your node directly. So you don't need to manage a web service yourself. But the caveat being that in general with LNURL and LNURL Pay, you're in the world of the web, and so privacy is kind of in terms of domain like DNS and that sort of stuff is its own can of worms. And I think that's one of the contentious points in terms of Bolt 12 versus the LNURL suite of things is because Bolt 12 is at the Lightning level. You can do certain things to make sure that it's private, and so there's a lot of discussion going around on like the pros and cons of both. But yeah, I'll leave it at that on that topic.
Yeah, yeah, cool. So I mean, digging into the Bolt 12 stuff a little bit more, it's obviously been a big talking point in the Lightning space sort of over the last year. Some people are for it, some are reserved, some are abstaining from giving a point of view. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about the details of how it, if you know how it might actually sort of affect the functionality of Lightning address? There's also actually another question in there from the audience about Bolt 12. Maybe I can read that out just in case actually there's any overlap. But RJ says, if or when Bolt 12 is widely supported by all nodes, right? That's another thing as well. It needs to be supported. What will be the use of LNURL Pay? or will it become deprecated? And will Lightning address work bolt 12? So yeah, a bit of overlap there. But do you have any expertise which maybe you could provide on um, how moving to bolt 12 with Lightning address or something would affect the sort of the UX of it, or even just what's going on in the background?
Yeah, definitely. So I think that's one of the things that's kind of fuzzy right now, because they're kind of both still evolving. There was I think a workshop recently though, where there was some like, so the proposer of Bolt 12, Rusty Russell, kind of was a part of a discussion where they proposed, I think, extending the LNURL pay spec so that you're basically using Bolt 12 instead of their spec. So whether or not that proposal was cheeky or not, or a legit proposal, I'm not totally sure, because as I mentioned, it's kind of a contentious thing between the two. But there are, there's thinking going on around that, and so I think it's, yeah, one of those things that's a little bit fuzzy. But I'm guessing that it's going to be, either they're both going to eventually coexist, because maybe there's some properties of either, that some people need for certain use cases, or maybe one kind of wins, and those who want Lightning addresses and are willing to kind of take the privacy risks that are associated with that, decide to use that, and it doesn't kind of matter whether it's using LNURL Pay or Bolt 12 under the hood. But yeah, I think it's a little bit uncertain right now, but I don't think that Lightning addresses are necessarily going to go away. For example, if Bolt 12 ends up replacing LNURL Pay or something like that. But yeah, I think it's up in the air.
Cool. One thing I noticed, just obviously looking through the Lightning Address website, so if anyone wants to check it out and find out more and figure out who is kind of providing, you can just head to this link, so lightningaddress.com. But yeah, one thing I noticed is that there are like 20 different providers, or maybe slightly less, which is really cool. Like, people are jumping on, they're providing a service. But I downloaded Zebedee. They sort of automatically register their users with a Lightning address. A couple of other folks do as well. There's a risk that I'm going to end up with like 10 different Lightning addresses, in the same way that I might end up with 10 different emails or something every time I sign up to a service. Is there a way of kind of aggregating these Lightning addresses, and a way to kind of like consolidate them a little bit more to solve that issue?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that's something that will maybe just end up being provided as a service. I saw a solution the other day, I think on GitHub, and I do not remember the name of it, but it was basically just acting as a proxy. So you'd be able to register a Lightning address, get one from their site, maybe self-host it, and then basically just like point it to uh, whatever wallet you want to be your main one, similar to if you wanted to like forward your email or something like that. So I think people are beginning to think about that a little bit. And yeah, it's relatively trivial to implement, I would think, because you're in the land of like HTTP requests and that sort of thing, and so it's really just like proxying requests. So yeah, I think maybe solutions like that might help with that a little bit. But yeah, we'll see if there's a way of down the line like bringing your domain specific Lightning address into some of these apps and services. I don't know if there's anything out there for that yet, but I guess we'll see what happens there.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, they're so similar to email addresses as well. I wonder, or at least the way that they look, and potentially the way that things can be sort of encoded and decoded and forwarded on to the sender receiver. I wonder if they're going to become ways of being able to log into sites as well at points and authenticate sort of stuff. That would be pretty cool to see. I don't know if it's technically possible, but it would definitely be cool. What happens if, I guess, on that point of consolidation or whatever it might be, like, what happens if a provider goes down? So let's say I have I certainly don't want to tarnish the name of Mash, but I'm just going to use it because obviously you work there. But like, let's say I have ed@getmash.com, and for some reason Mash decides to crash. Like, what happens to my Lightning address? What happens to the payments that are trying to go to that Lightning address? Do they just fail if the provider's down? Like, what kind of happens there?
Yeah, I mean, and then that's a really good point. And I think that's those kind of scenarios are definitely kind of in this world of the web and which is centralized and you have servers that are owned by companies and that sort of thing. There could be scenarios where they go down, and maybe their service is maybe it's non-custodial and it's just proxying requests for you to your own node or something like that, but it still goes down, and like you just lose access to that Lightning address. Like I think that's like a definitely a valid concern. There's definitely trust that's being put in the providers in that case, and I think that's maybe one of the reasons that Bolt 12, if it ends up becoming implemented in some of these Lightning providers. If that ends up happening, then it's just like if I'm running my own wallet, and it supports Bolt 12, then it supports Bolt 12, and it's kind of completely handled by me. There's no web servers or anything like that. So yeah, I think it's definitely a valid concern and kind of one that comes with living in the world of services and that sort of thing. So yeah.
Cool. And I mean, there seem like a lot of benefits to this Lightning address. Like, it seems like a really good user experience, especially for people who are sort of coming in and, maybe want to get set up. Maybe they just want to create an account and, play to earn with gaming with sort of like Thunder or Zebedee or something like that. And it's just a really easy way to get onboarded. But like, are there any downsides with regards to like sending and receiving payments? So like, are there extra fees that come with it? If someone sends 100 sats to my ed@getmash Lightning address, you know, is Getmash, are you guys taking any fees for that? Or is it completely just sort of bypassing Mash? You're just doing me a favor by hosting it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. So the kind of nice thing about the kind of the LN Euro Pay suite is it's really just a way of facilitating the flow of Bolt 11 invoices. So um, there can't really be anything fishy going on there, and really like if there's routing fees or something like that, you're always going to be paying that as part of the Bolt 11 payment process. And it's kind of I think I walked through a little bit the sender. It's their wallet needs to verify the invoice that's coming back, so that there's no the amount that the invoice was generated for wasn't jacked up or something like that. So I think really it's just seen as a tool to make it easier to talk between lightning powered services. And so yeah, likely hard to shove extra fees kind of into that flow. Seen more as like a tool for connecting things,
Cool,
less of like a
cool.
way of making more money, I think.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it seems to be just a great way of facilitating more payments. Like you said, if Bob's asleep and can't generate an invoice, then it's a nice way to be able to do it for them. Cool. Well, are there any before we leave anyone, where's the best place to, if I'm a developer looking to maybe build this out myself or whatever, like, where's the best place to get started? Are there some good sort of documentation and resources online? Do I head to the Lightning Address website to do that, or is there a good repo that you could point us to?
Yeah, definitely. So in terms of LNURL Pay, the GitHub repo, the LUDs GitHub repo is really good. And I believe in that repo, they kind of link out to different resources in terms of like libraries and that sort of stuff. And then the Lightning address repo as well has some really good resources just on how to implement it. And one of them, I can't remember if it's the Lightning address repo or the LNURL Pay repo, has like a DIY guide, and they kind of just walk you through like, hey, do you want to add this to software that you're building? Here's how you do it. And they talk about like the different bridge services and that sort of thing that I mentioned earlier, and the different ways of of doing it. So yeah, definitely check that out. And yeah.
Cool, cool. Well, obviously at the moment we've got the Legends of Lightning tournament going on. We've seen, I think there are a few projects who are potentially thinking about implementing some Lightning address functionality, or at least giving sort of the nice to have thing for their users to be able to claim them and get one themselves. Have you been keeping much an eye on the tournament? Are there any projects that are catching your eye, or maybe even just to dumb down that question a little bit, as a Lightning and sort of Bitcoin developer, are there any tools or apps that you've been kind of thinking a little bit about, or that you want to see built, or if you had, some spare time and could take part in the tournament, is there anything that you would want to work on in particular?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, I will admit I'm haven't been right now at least keeping up with kind of what's the projects that are being hacked on. I've seen a couple of, I think people have been sharing them on Stacker News, so I've seen a
Mhm.
few, but I can't remember them off the top of my head. But I'm definitely excited to see kind of um, uh, what the outcome is. In terms of ideas, though, I kind of thought of one as you were. I think you were asking about what happens if the Lightning address service provider goes down. A cool product could potentially be, almost like if you were to pay an email provider. Imagine if you could, uh, pay to uh, pay to some pay to some service, like pay an invoice to basically have access to a, a Lightning address on their domain, and just basically be like, almost like what email providers are, and potentially just charging people to um, kind of have access to a Lightning address. That could potentially be a cool, really simple product. And then yeah, I think just in terms of other things with Lightning addresses specific, I think there's going to be um, some cool stuff kind of coming out that is focused on like um, allowing you to receive funds for something by putting in your Lightning address. So I can't quite remember if Lightning addresses specifically have been talked about in the context of like podcasting 2.0, but imagine if you're a podcaster or something, you put in your Lightning address and you start receiving payments as people are listening or something like that. So I think that is maybe the more compelling way of building on Lightning addresses is maybe providing it as an option for people to accept payments from your app somewhere else where they already have a Lightning address. Because as you mentioned, there's a lot of providers out there now. Maybe people are they have their favorite one already, and they would just rather have maybe it's a custodial kind of system they have or non-custodial setup, and they just want to receive payments there. Um, it's going to be cool to see if people are building out that sort of functionality, kind of connecting with the broader Lightning address ecosystem within their apps, just to make it easier to receive funds. So I think that's maybe the thing that I'm looking forward to seeing happen.
Cool. Wow. If anyone wants to go ahead and build it, feel free. Um, Jake, thank you very much for coming on today. We really appreciate it. Always interested to hear more about Lightning Address, and big hats off to you guys at Mash. You guys are doing some awesome work. I mean, another great Lightning Address provider, and actually, just that kind of reminded me, what you were saying about sending and receiving value or value for value over the web. I was on Twitter this morning and went on someone's page, and there's now the tip button in there because it kind of just like reads that Lightning address. We're going to put some Lightning addresses in the show notes as well. So Jake, if you have one, definitely send it my way. And then, if you got Albi installed on your browser, you can really easily send Jake some sats and just say thanks for coming on. But yeah, great to have you, man. Thank you very much. And looking forward to what gets built with this.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Cool. Catch you soon, guys. Thank you.
Bye.